I've been fascinated by India's history, particularly from the time the Europeans found a sea route round Africa to trade. During our 5 Tiger Park tour of India, we had the opportunity to stop over in Calcutta. This place in front of us now.
Yeah.
What was that?
Wash. Yes.
No, see that building?
Oh, behind, yeah.
Yeah.
Whether it's us moving.
Calcutta features very significantly in the European trade history. I wanted to see what we could find of its early days. Kolkata exists because of the industrious 17th century Bengalis. Before we do that, let's ask ourselves why the Europeans were in India. During the European Middle Ages, spices were as valuable as gold and gems in Europe, and the single most important force that was driving the world's economy. The lack of refrigeration and poor standards of hygiene meant food often spoilt quickly, and spices were in great demand to mask the flavour of food that was far from fresh. The trade was dominated by the Ottoman Turks and Arabs of the Middle East. The big game changer was the Portuguese, who found a sea route round Africa to India and Asia. They also had sailing ships that could make the journey both ways. Portuguese arrived on the Indian subcontinent in 1498, and 30 years later the Mughals from Central Asia. Who were the Mughals? A warrior chieftain from Uzbekistan in Central Asia, a descendant of Genghis Khan, swept down the plains of northern India in 1526, defeating the Sultan of Delhi. This was 30 years after the arrival of the Portuguese. Subsequent generations of the Mughals tried to increase the empire. None was able to conquer the south and west of India until the 6th emperor, Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658, but ruined the Mughal Empire in the process, which he acknowledged on his deathbed in 1707. The English East India Company was created 100 years before that in 1600, purely for trade by the merchants of London. At this time, India was the world's industrial powerhouse and the world's leader in manufacturing textiles. The industrious Bengalis attracted the Portuguese, the Armenians, the Dutch, the French, the English, and the Mughals themselves, who all set up trading bases along the Hooghly River. These trading bases gave them access to the sea lanes of world trade. You know how it is? Do you get it wrong? Bengal was the Mughals' wealthiest region of India, providing most of the revenues to their central government in Delhi. It was Europe's single most important supplier of goods from Asia. Bengal was described as the finest and most fruitful country in the world, and the richest, most populous and best cultivated, with a myriad of weavers. There was an estimated 25,000 weavers in Dhaka alone, producing unrivaled luxury textiles, silks and woven muslin. In August 1690, Job Charnock, an East India Company factor or trader, set up a new company trading base on the Hooghly by purchasing land between the village of Calcutta and Sutanuti. The location he chose was described by a contemporary as he could not have found a more unhealthy place on all the river. This area eventually became known as Calcutta. The first members of my own family came after the Jacobite Wars in Britain. They came from Persia and Scotland to India in the 1750s. We start our search at St. John's Church, which was built in the late 1700s. Here we discover some of the early trading history. So this is his...
I think it might be that one.
Oh, one further down here. In a corner of St. John's Churchyard, we found these very early structures. One was to the memory of Job Charnock, the man who persuaded the very reluctant East India Company Governing Council in Madras that the very best place to establish its headquarters of trade in Bengal was an area between the villages of Sutanuti and Calcutta, because of its defensive position and its deep water anchorage for the fleet. Yeah, fantastic actually seeing these things. We have to remind ourselves that in 1690, communication between the East India Company's headquarters in London and India was at the speed of a sailing ship and often took over a year for messages to be passed each way. Hence they set up local councils in India to administer its trade decisions. This mausoleum was erected over Charnock's central grave by his son-in-law and successor. It was built by Bengali craftsmen, and its incorporation of Indo-Islamic design was to reflect the intersection of two cultures of his marriage. He had a Hindu wife, which was not uncommon for Europeans at that time. But what was very different was that she had been rescued by him from sati, the Hindu practice of wife burning with her deceased husband on his funeral pyre. It is said that Charnock was smitten by her beauty and rescued her and called her Maria. She converted him to Hinduism in all ways, although it is said he remained a devout Christian.
Is this it? Yeah. So, Job Charnock.
What about Charnock himself? Well, I learnt that he came from the north of England, joined the East India Company's service in Bengal when he was 28 years old. He gradually rose through the company's ranks. After 8 years, he was a senior merchant. After another 10 years, he became the third most important official in Bengal. After 27 years service, Charnock finally assumed position of agent and chief in the Bay of Bengal. It was about this time that Charnock suffered the deep personal loss in the death of his wife Maria. They were devoted to each other. Maria was buried like a Christian and not cremated as a Hindu. Charnock adopted the Sufi practice of sacrificing a cockerel over her grave each year on the anniversary of her death. He also built his garden house at Barwell so as to be near her grave. I wonder if her grave still exists. Regarding the training base that he ended up calling Calcutta, permission was granted by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in Delhi for the company to build its trading post or factory here. Charnock set up headquarters on the 10th of February 1691. An imperial grant was issued for the English to contentedly continue their trade. Charnock died a year later at the age of 62 and here in Calcutta, which was a very ripe age for a European to survive in Calcutta, and we'll hear more about that later. As I mentioned, all this was done with the permission of the Mughal rulers. The big problem for the Indian subcontinent was after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, the empire started to disintegrate. In 1737, the Maharashtrias, a people of the Deccan of southern India, penetrated from one end of Hindustan to the other in armed bodies, which met little resistance, carrying out considerable pillage, reaching the gates of the Mughal capital, Delhi. In May 1739, the first invasion of the Indian subcontinent for 2 centuries occurred when Persian forces from the north entered the Mughal capital. One report said the Shah's forces massacred at least 100,000 people in Delhi. By 1753, the Mughal rulers continued to destroy themselves in yet another civil war, which brought to a close any foreseeable hope of any recovery for their rule. The European conflicts also spilt over into India as the French and British trading companies pursued their own agendas. This monument commemorates an incident in 1758 when a Mughal force captured the British fort at Kolkata. The garrison surrendered and had been treated unusually well by Mughal standards. There was no enslavement, no summary execution, no impaling, no beheading, and no torture. But all the survivors were herded into a small punishment cell 18 feet by 14 feet with a small window. It is not clear how many died, but one account has 145 men went in and 22 survived. It became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Meanwhile, Calcutta became a haven of private enterprise, drawing not just Bengali textile merchants and moneylenders, but also Parsis, Gujaratis, and Marwari entrepreneurs and business houses found it safe and sheltered environment in which to make their fortunes. Calcutta's legal system and English commercial law all contributed to make it increasingly the destination of choice for merchants and bankers from across Asia. Meanwhile, 2/3 of the company's servants who came to Calcutta never made it back to Britain. A quarter of the European soldiers died each year. Poor understanding of tropical diseases, rudimentary medicines, and the lack of understanding about proper sanitation all added to the deaths. The average life expectancy in the 18th century for Europeans was 2 monsoons. Within a year of the formation of Calcutta, 1,000 people were living in the settlement. Here lies the body of William Speke, aged 18. And there were 460 names in the burial book. There was a saying that they live like Englishmen and die like rotten sheep. By the late 1700s, the first British burial ground at St John's Church was overflowing. The new cemetery, Great Christian Burial Ground as it was called, and later called South Street Cemetery, was located in the countryside in the middle of fields. The first of our ancestors went to India in the 1700s, as I mentioned earlier, and we can find one of them in South Street Cemetery. Oh, there's it.
Title wise is your. You have to go title wise. কত নম্বর আছে 767
That was James. Are there 2 Rattrays there? That's James at the bottom. Is the one at the top?
No, just that one.
James Rattray.
Thomas's cousin, David.
So we've got the locations for James Rattray's grave. We're now off to look for it. One of the reasons for its location here was there was concern that the sight of a funeral procession winding its way through the town several times a week would erode the residents' morale. Also, the new cemetery in town might be a health hazard. Goodness me, look at the size of these things. William Johnson, who departed this life on the 4th of May 1799, aged 43. Age 46, Mrs. Sarah Celia Duncan, widow of the late Robert Duncan, who departed their life. Mrs. Hesselweiss. Look at the size of these things. The new cemetery is a time capsule, as it holds the remains of some 1,600 British men, women and children from the 18th and early 19th century. Age 21. It was opened in August 1767, and the last burial was in 1840. Some of the shapes are quite bizarre, aren't they? Look at this one. As mentioned earlier, there was no understanding of the causes of death. It was believed at the time that fruits such as watermelons, pineapples, were one way people caught disease. The sale of fruit would be banned during an outbreak of cholera. Each coffin was carried on the shoulders of the deceased person's friends, as there were no hearses in the town. Torches would light the way. The grave monuments belonged to the British soldiers, administrators and their families, and looking at each tomb one can recognise that many women died very young from the complications of childbirth. The grave inscriptions reveal a lot about 18th century Kolkata, some sober and some also mischievous. See what the inscription says. Kathy! To the memory of James Rattray, he was born on the 5th May 1776 and closed on an honourable and useful life as second judge of the provincial court of Dhaka on the 15th of February 1818. So 1818.
So it's 23 plus 18, isn't it? Which is
23 plus 18, 33, 41.
quite good by the standards, I think.
God. This is the tomb of one of the remarkable 18th century personalities, Hindoo Stuart. You'll find referred to in many early European Indian history books. He was attracted to Hinduism as soon as he arrived in India. He took to bathing in the Ganges at dawn. What was it?
He was a frequent letter writer to the Calcutta Telegraph newspaper.
encouraging European ladies to adopt the sari, a suggestion which in the opening years of the 19th century must have been considered outrageous to many of those at which it was directed. He subsequently published his letters and some of the responses from the less amused readers in a superb volume exhaustively entitled The Ladies Monitor, being a series of letters first published in Bengal on the subject of female apparel, tending to favour a regulated adoption of Indian costume and the rejection of superfluous vesture by the ladies of his country.
Interesting. Because they're probably wearing corsets even as days well, were they? That's all.
Exactly, with incidental remarks on Hindu beauty, whalebone stays, iron busks, Indian corsets, man milliners, idle bachelors, hair powder, waiting ladies and footmen. This is his book, I think.
Elizabeth Jane Barwell, the celebrated Miss Sanderson, married the 18th September 1776 to Robert Barwell, the friend of Warren Hastings, member of the Council of East India Company, died 7th of November 1778, aged 23. God. At the suggestion of the Kolkata Historical Society, this monument was restored and this inscription was added by the government of Bengal, 1907. I'd also like to take an opportunity to thank Dipenjan Ghosh, who describes himself as a history buff and a professional broadcaster from Kolkata. His YouTube channel is People Tree World, Live History India.